Welcome to today's webinar. It'll be just a chat on who's subsidizing Canada's economy. When Canadians grumble about, their energy ambitions, labeling the province of Alberta as greedy for wanting to pump more oil, few stop to ask how much money from each barrel ends up flowing to them. The irony is staggering. The very provinces rallying for green purity are cashing checks underwritten not just by Alberta, but indirectly by the United States, which purchases over 95% of Alberta's oil and gas paid in US dollars. That revenue doesn't stop at the Rockies. It flows straight to Ottawa, funding equalization programs, national infrastructure, and federal services that benefit the rest of the country. So in this week's newsletter, I called it what it is. The United States is subsidizing the Canadian economy through Alberta. The United States is subsidizing the Canadian economy through Alberta. Well, some balked at that. Some of the feedback that I got was, well, it's really not a subsidy. The United States is buying that 95% of the oil because they need it. Well, that's not what Trump says and not what many Americans say, is that they've got plenty of energy. They really don't need our oil. Well, now we're into a discussion. So I probably should have put the word subsidize in quotes, but the point's made. Much of the revenue coming into Canada from the United States is coming through Alberta to the federal government that then flows out to the provinces. So when you ask the question, who's subsidizing Canada, as a question, the reality is the United States. Now, we can discuss whether or not that makes sense and what the implications are, because some say, well, we should diversify the Alberta economy and in so doing, diversify the Canadian economy so that we're not so heavily reliant on selling something in the United States that it does or doesn't need. But the reality is today, Alberta revenues, and nobody is saying in Alberta that we want to hold on to them. That's not the basis of the discussion. But Alberta is balking at not being able to develop the energy industry, which has Canadian interests in mind. So that's the topic for today. And I know, Tommy, I'll credit you with having raised the question last week that prompted me to put that article together in order to raise the point that Alberta isn't doing this out of selfishness or pure selfishness. There are Canadian beneficiaries of the revenue that Alberta generates from that energy. And Alberta is also not denying climate change, but saying in the meantime, this is going to be a transition during which energy is going to continue to be required by such things as the rapidly emerging AI industry. So here we are. I'm excited about this topic. It keeps me awake at night. Certainly gets me writing and thinking. Hopefully it does you too. Anyone want to jump in about Danielle's overture to Ottawa? Trump's denial of need, the extent to which Canada really relies on Alberta revenues. As Jack Mintz said in a webinar a few weeks ago, should that revenue go to zero, Canada's weakened significantly. So this is not lightweight stuff. This is not simply academic. There's things underway that may make this a very relevant discussion around such things as sovereignty, diversification, trust in the United States as a trading partner.
I can see why people say subsidizing. Obviously, we're selling a good and getting price for it. No different than we would say we're subsidizing a farmer for selling his grain. But the point is well made that, you know, as we put in the article, a tremendous amount of money is captured by all of Canada for those sales that fund our lifestyle up here beyond just Alberta at quite a phenomenal amount. When we were investigating this article, I was quite shocked at the rate of return that Alberta has been giving Canada over the time since 1905 at 11.6% per year since 1905, annualized over that time. Obviously, it didn't start in 1905, but that even makes the from 1947 to current times rate of return even more substantial. But it was just glaring at how much value Canada has received from Alberta, I mean, it's just enormous compared to any other province. And it really, for me, kind of even woke me up to the argument that Alberta has against the rest of the nation of, when does this end? Like, when does the investment get repaid? And get off Alberta's back kind of statement went through my mind anyway.
The equalization payments I referred to or referred to in the article as the glue of Confederation. There are have provinces, there are have not provinces. The have province were lucky enough to have fish at one time, or to have lumber at one time, or to have minerals at one time, or to have oil and gas at one time. And often these resources, these natural resources, either get over harvested and are no longer of economic value for those jurisdictions, or some regulation comes along, or technology shifts and the economy goes away. Alberta has been fortunate for the last, well, since the 60s, I guess, or before that, because it was gas and some oil, but the discovery of the oil sands, which to some extent was an investment of the federal government. Some of the revenues that flowed into Alberta for research purposes and development were federal in nature, received as payments from other provinces to Alberta. So, Alberta hasn't been alone in the development of that industry, and this is part of what a nation is the sharing. And Canada, as a nation, has been well endowed with commodities from coast to coast, north to south, east to west, as a sharing state. It's what the glue has been. So when Alberta wants to further develop a resource that would contribute to equalization payments, you would think that everybody would be up and celebrating, just as Northern Ontario wants to further develop its minerals, just as Northwest Territories wants to develop its energy, just as BC wants to develop its lumber. And just as Eastern Canada would love to have the fishing industry back and see some regulation of what goes on in the Grand Banks globally. But right now, Edmonton's front and center, or Alberta is front and center, and I personally don't get it. And it's not just because I live in Alberta, and it's not because my salary may be better than someone living in Prince Edward Island. But my salary and the level of salaries in Alberta is to some extent a reflection of the fact that Alberta has a high demand for labor, much of which comes from elsewhere in the country. And that high demand means higher salaries as incentives to attract that labor, all of which is attributable to the fact we have a oil and gas industry that is very lucrative and to some say has created a Dutch disease, so that when the price goes up or down, our economy goes up or very down. So we go through this boom bust cycle, which is very unfortunate. And Canada will as well, to the extent it doesn't diversify, and it isn't adequately. So the article in National Post has said we've lost our status as a trading nation. That the extent of our GDP based on trading has collapsed in the last, well, this 10 years of this lost generation. So I don't know how many young people get an education in the history of Canada or in its economy.
I think that history has been changed remarkably over the last 20 years, and things like civics or how government works, all of that is bypassed now in terms of some political correct agenda where you change what Canadians with a history of contribution to this country, and they're sort of eliminated from the history books because they're no longer politically correct. So the culture and the economy, it's culture that's guided the economy for the last decade.
So it isn't just that we've lost 10 years of our economy. We may have lost a generation or two of young people.
Exactly. Yes. And they are all sort of become these creatures of entitlement. And, gone is the what can I do? It's what do I need and what do I deserve? I'm sorry, I've got a terrible cold. I shouldn't be talking. But
Let-
these
we did talk a little bit about that last week, Alona, is the extent to which youth today are have expectations that they will be taken care of. I'm not quite so sure, and that doesn't mean I'm arguing. I would like to know what the perspectives of youth are after this 20-year period that we've gone through where the economy was supposed to take care of itself and where there's very little understanding. I'm not saying respect or appreciation, but very little understanding of the economy of this country and the glue and how to sustain that glue so that we do prosper. I mean, we have a prime minister today who would like to see Canada as a super energy power.
Yes, but he has an identity minister, Canadian identity minister, who basically said an untruth and said, you know, we're not going to be, we don't need any more pipelines. And that man and his ideology has been forcing Canada toward an impossible ideology ever since for the last decade.
Look,
And
we know where he's coming from.
yeah,
And comment that we're not yet at capacity in our pipelines. Well, you don't want to be at capacity. That's crisis time. You want to plan a pipeline well enough in advance, appreciating that you will be at capacity by the time a pipeline gets built. But putting that aside, I'd like to have diversity in any decision making that I'm making, and I'm sure that that cabinet will have diversity. They will have the pros and the cons, those that take an advocacy position regarding environment or economy, and they'll have to wrestle that through because there exist in Canada those various perspectives that you've got to be respectful in a democracy and listen to. Now, whether or not you have veto power and wish to override them because it's in Canada's interest becomes a decision that almost is warranting a referendum or an election on whether or not Canadians understand their own economy. And if what we were just discussed about our youth are not likely to vote in the interest of the economy, they're more likely to vote solely in the interest of the environment because that's how they've been educated. Therein
Um,
lies therein lies a potential problem. Dale?
I'd like to introduce a youth to our conversation. Bobby Vivek, Vivek Bobby, is might want to introduce himself. He represents the Youth Council here in Alberta. There have been some comments made about youth and their knowledge of what's going on, and I'd like to ask Bobby, is what you're hearing right now reflective of what you understand of this situation?
Well, I do think that you guys have a very solid point about the whole cultural trend of entitlement, but I would say that it's a mischaracterization in terms of the fact that while there is probably a very large demographic that does think like that and is driven by um, activist motivations, I guess you could say, I would say that there is a very large demographic of students and youth who are moving towards building the future and who are active participants in our community. So I'd say that there is still a very strong youth culture regarding progress and growth, not just in terms of the environment, but in terms of the infrastructure, the industry, and the culture of Alberta.
So they haven't lost ambition. They're still aspiring. They haven't given up and feel they need to rely on the state.
No, I feel that that is, well, this might be something that's my particular economic cohort of peers, but there is a large group of students who are very ambitious, trying to make the most of themselves. But the thing is, a lot of these students, they tend to leave Alberta and go to big centers of like more concentrated cities, I would say, compared to staying in Alberta. Because I know that a lot of my friends, for instance, they went to large urban centers in the United States, as opposed to staying in Calgary or in Alberta, because there's a tendency of brain drain across the entire country, I'd say.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, Vivek, you and I met earlier today. You got a
Yep.
copy of the proposal?
Mm-hmm.
So it was a rich conversation, and what we're working on for those of you that have expressed interest in the topic of engaging youth that came up last week is we think we can put an event together as a kickstart in Calgary and work up from there, engaging youth in a discussion of the future of work, possibly on the university campus, one of the advanced education facilities, in the interest of drawing youth, not just those coming out of high school, but those at the university level as well, all of whom are likely focused on that question that is so relevant to young people is what is the future of work? What am I going to be when I grow up? Will I ever grow up? All of those questions. So thanks for the conversation this afternoon, Vivek. It was rich, and I really enjoyed your input. So hopefully we can pull this off.
Absolutely. Thank you, Perry.
Tommy, I know you kicked this off with a perspective, and I was being respectful, and clearly we don't agree on all matters of this, but where do you think we're at on this topic? Yep, you're muted again. No, you're still muted. Oh, doggone. It doesn't show muted on his screen, Randall.
Right, I think it's his own microphone.
Mike, Tommy, you're still muted. Can you hear me, Tommy? Nod your head if you hear me. Yeah, he's still looking around to figure out why he might be muted. Anyway, I'll let him work on that. And if it gets released, come on back on board. Mel, anything you want to add here? You're muted, Mel.
Yeah, not particularly. I've seen a number of articles as well, and some of the newsletters are very interesting where you pick up on one line, and I tend to do a lot of research on a couple of items that intrigue me, and this was one of them. I've lived in 6 provinces and worked in 4, so you see in the newspapers whether people are first Canadian and then Albertan, or Albertan and then Canadian. I go Canadian, then Albertan, and that's the way. But the equalization payments has been a sore point for a lot of people. There's not a lot that we can do as individuals, but I think understanding how they're put together is one thing, and it's too big a job for someone to sit down and understand it in an hour, as I'm sure a lot of you who've looked into it will agree. But what we need to do is, I guess, look at what would we put in place instead of that? How could we make it better? It's, in a sense, there have been comparisons made to, a family of 10 kids kind of thing, and there's a couple of them get pretty good paying jobs after school, and the father's got a job, the mother's got a job, and everybody's got to have the same kind of quality of living. So how do we put something in place that guarantees that? That's probably an issue. It's a full-time job to try to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, there you go. You can look forward to your retirement. There's a job for you.
Well, I'm about 14 years late in starting, I guess.
Yogi, you always have a rich perspective on any topic that we're dealing with here. Anything you want to add here?
Well, there are internal tensions within any country. It makes me wonder whether whether one of the problems that we have in Canada is that the provinces are too strong. So, for example, in England and even France, the provinces really don't have a lot of to say. They don't have a lot of money, and they don't have a lot of taxing power. In the US, what we seem to have is more state power, but again, in the 21st century, they have real limitations on their taxing power. And I don't know if that leads to more harmony or less regional disparity, because all these countries I've listed all have significant regional disparity in terms of economic activity, personal income, standard of living, all of those sorts of things. But in Canada, my perspective is that the provinces are quite powerful, and as you would expect, they want to exercise that power. And it seems to be leading to more tensions and conflict and disagreement that is healthy for the future of the country.
Well, I mean, you get disagreements in the United States between Mississippi and New York, or between Texas and Montana. However, you've got 50 states, and it's a big family. And as a consequence of being, quote, a big family, discussion often ends up at the Senate, where everybody's got an equal vote. In Canada, with only 13 provinces, and with Quebec having the veto power that it has as a byproduct of history, and with Alberta having the economic strength, or Ontario having the political strength, we've got provinces that are almost singular. There isn't a block. We don't have a block in Canada. What we've got is 13 quite different, well, not maybe 13, maybe 4 very different perspectives, and very little likelihood that they'll get together. I mean, Quebec's interests are very, I wouldn't say selfish, but singular. And Alberta's interests appear to be quite singular. And so what you're ending up with is very little opportunities for compromise or for a bloc to form. And that calls then for leadership at a federal level to champion unity. But what we've got at the federal level under the Trudeau regime now, and the Trudeau regime of his predecessor, is trying to pare back the interests of Alberta, but not pare back the interests of Quebec. And therein lies what Alberta has seen as unfair, on why Quebec's interests should be so important and Alberta's interests less important, when Alberta makes an economic contribution to the country, and Quebec, as a taker, it isn't even recognized their hydroelectric power revenues when you're doing an equalization campaign or calculation.
So well summarized, and I think Preston Manning and others hardly agree with what you just summarized.
But you know, what I just said and what Preston Manning may say is making people angry. I'm having lunch, or not lunch, coffee on next Tuesday with the former MLA from Alberta, who is outspoken about her views of Danielle's manner in approaching Ottawa. And my comment to her on Facebook, which has led to us having this coffee, was maybe what Danielle's manner is reflecting of is the degree of frustration that Alberta has faced after years of waiting for a polite overture from Ottawa to have a discussion with Alberta about how to manage an economy that is making a contribution to Canada, and yet, you know, scaling it down over time, but not abruptly, which is what the carbon tax seems to have had in mind, or cutting with C29 the capacity to transport oil.
Thank you. So Danielle Smith and her predecessors used to be trying to be more polite and more, if you like, exhibit the Canadian characteristics that are often described, but that wasn't getting her anywhere. So she's changed the tune, and it's become more confrontational, more divisive. The temperature's gone up. I worry about the impact of that on Canada's future.
I feel compelled to reflect, and this is with tongue-in-cheek humor. Let Them Freeze in the Dark was one of our premiers, but I think he backed away from that. Before I call on you, Bill, Randall, you and I chatted earlier of your perspective of Danielle's manner or matter. Could you recall that conversation? You want to reflect on it?
Well, I was just thinking that she has a communications manner of a thinker rather than a feeler, and can be come across very direct, clear-headed. Some people might interpret that as being adamant. It's not necessarily the case. And secondly, with the polarization that we have in Alberta and left, right, around the world, people are very quick to judge the intentions of the others on the other side, labeling them as evil and mischievous and dictatorial. But I think it's very difficult to claim the middle ground now for civil dialogue. So I just think that she's being written off too quickly by a lot of people. I'm not sure what her intentions are, but I think that there is a worldwide movement towards local rather than global. As same as people want to control their own lives, so they pull back from a lot of what's going on in the world to kind of create their own safe space. There's so much anxiety that we're trying to, even cancel culture is about closing off those things that we can't understand or don't want to face, so that we have at least the appearance of a safe space. But this translates then into censorship and loss of freedoms of speech and this black and white evil, because once you stop the dialogue, you can fantasize about what's going on that other side over there. They are evil beings. They're possessed by demons, and the imagination just goes crazy. So we, like with KEI Network, we have to preserve the middle ground with open public dialogue and not be afraid to listen to people who have different opinions. I think one of the big problems we have is that people start with different assumptions, so they come to different conclusions.
Well, I mean, I think you've reflected on what KEI has reflected on numerous times, is we need to have conversations. This is fundamental to democracy, even though those conversations may be uncomfortable. There are people that feel we should not talk about sovereignty. We ran into that when we ran the events in Calgary and Edmonton, is, oh, you're therefore favoring sovereignty by having a discussion about it. Not at all. And in fact, what you're doing is you're helping inform citizens, which is the foundation of democracy, is an informed voter. Your turn, Bill.
Yeah. So, yeah, Canada's issue is not just economic; it's mostly political. And to go to that great analogy of a family with 10 kids, what you have is the two older kids, especially one of them, is taking all the economic resources and buying a brand new car and living the high life, and the one that's younger but providing all the income, they're not allowing such a thing, and taking the funds of the younger one without the younger one actually having a voice to determine how the money is spent. And that's, Alberta's not had an issue of helping the Canada, as you said, the glue. It's the fact that we don't have a political voice in determining how that's done. I mean, it was raised about how do other countries do it, and whether the state, the province or the state in the United States has less or more power. But for the example of the United States, they have two systems, one that represents the population and then one that represents the geography. Right. And so they have a balance so that the higher population centers don't dominate the politics. You have to go to Wisconsin or Montana to get elected in the federal system of the United States. So you have to deal with them, and you have to provide them some political voice in decision making for a national leader like the president to become president of the United States. Canada, they don't even have to come to Western Canada at all. They just have to do Ontario and Quebec, and they get elected. And that's the real issue. And that's what Manning had recognized when he was trying to do his Triple E Senate, and the West wants in, is to try to give a balanced political view to Canadian decision making. And it hasn't happened. And that's the real issue. If Manning was successful, we would be here talking about separation, regardless of the equalization payments or what they may be. It's the lack of any federal political voice down east, and then the pandering of the east to say, oh, you're just a bunch of whiny brats. We know better than you do about how to run your resources or your world or your culture or the way you want to live. You have to live like a bunch of Torontonians or Montrealers. So that's the question that I've seen within the movement of independence. Yes, we do have wallet separatists, but it's really who's determining the decisions of the nation, and then fundamentally the province. Well, it certainly isn't Alberta, and that's where the real frustration has always been built.
Well, this discussion, I mean, the point that you've raised, and it's been core to what we've been chatting about the last few minutes, is core to next week's newsletter. Next week's newsletter is all about who can save Canada. If separatism does become a serious discussion, then we need a leader or leaders at the provincial level and below that are prepared to reach out to save Canada as a single entity. And without that, we do run the risk of this continuation of different interests in a country that can't hold these interests together. Now, the topic today was who's subsidizing Canada, and the illusion is that the United States is subsidizing Canada, and it's being tolerated. Why would Trump talk about you don't need the United States not needing Canadian resources? Is it solely in the interest of diversifying his own economy and thereby developing the capacity to source itself in self-interest, in nationalism, in protectionism and pulling back? But when he says we don't need your resources, he is also implying we are subsidizing you with everything that we buy that we really don't need. And it's that assumption that he's taking that gives him the position of saying, I'm therefore subsidizing you. That's what gets Canadians upset, is they really don't feel it's a subsidy at all. They feel you're buying what you desperately need in your lumber, your minerals, your oil, your gas, your lobsters from Nova Scotia and the East Coast. Go ahead, Dale.
So we've heard a little bit about Danielle Smith and some of the approach she's taking. I think she made it very clear in her 9 requests to Carney. I put that in the chat. I don't think that these are unreasonable, but what happens is we certainly have a bombastic press that is anti Danielle and very much is being promulgated. As far as the U.S. subsidizing or supporting Canada, one of the things that hasn't been brought up clearly is that the world oil price versus the Texas the price that we get from the U.S. is also subsidized by Alberta. We actually get less for our oil going into the U.S. than we would on the world market, which is one of the concerns Danielle has also expressed.
Well,
The last, yeah,
that discussion came up in the network this week, and that discount is not just an agreement. There is reasons. We're landlocked. We don't have adequate capacity. The quality of the oil sands product has more sulfur in it. Blah blah blah. There are a number of reasons why that discount occurs.
yes, but that doesn't take away from the fact that if we had access to Tidewater and we could get that out there. So in fact, when we're looking at what Danielle's position is with respect to getting access to Tidewater and the kinds of things that are happening with Bill 69 and 48, that's where some of the animosity, I think, comes up, where this is not understood and it's seen by, let's say, the East as a greedy sort of approach for us just to get more. One other thing that I want to address, because it was brought up with respect to sovereignty and the provinces in Alberta, I think that Alberta has an opportunity to be a leader in the development of the Confederation as it was initially identified. Anybody that's been made familiar with the myth as Canada recognize that there are a number of things that are going on right now that are not in keeping with the way that the BNA Act and the Westminster System 1931 identified, and in that the provinces were to speak to the analogy of the 10 kids. What's happening is we're talking about 10 kids in the city versus 10 kids on the farm. 10 kids on the farm, which we are more like than in the city. And that's what we really have been divorced from, is that whole concept of the reality that we are a country that is together and the 10 kids need to work together. And when the parents are giving favor to one and not to the other, what Canada has set up in the Confederation originally and was usurped by the federal government is the ability to have those 10 kids speak with each other, work it out, and then tell the parents what they can do on the farm.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, the urban-rural split and the east-west split both are fundamental to Canada. By the way, you did raise the issue of Danielle and her style. We've seen a personality in the United States get a lot of attention about his manner versus his objectives. And I think we're seeing in Canada a very similar attack by the media of attacking the personality and the style as opposed to the substance. I think what Daniel wants to see occurred, and what I think we all hope for, is that Canada will have a discussion on those 9 issues as opposed to on her personality. Vivek, you go first. Go ahead, and then I'll call on Yogi.
All right. So I wanted to actually think about why the United States is advocating at this time, and saying that, okay, we don't need Canada's resources and all of that. In my worldview, I believe that after 2020, a fundamental shift occurred, and that is the shift in the paradigm of the economic model of the world. So before, the world relied largely on globalization, and it still does to a large extent. But what happened after 2020 was that the United States realized that supply chains across the world are not sustainable. It's not sustainable to keep manufacturing chips in Taiwan when your largest rival is right on the doorstep of its border. So I think in this instance, what the United States realized was that there is a need for the localization of the supply chain. And if you look around the world, this is happening all across the world. Recently, you'll notice that in Europe, they started a massive rearmament program. And the United States was, in a sense, is sort of decoupling from Europe, if you notice the way that everything is happening there. And the European defense contractors are getting more contracts in order to actually industrialize Europe, build up the armaments factories, and kind of wage a war against Russia. So the United States, in this instance, then, it says that it doesn't need Canadian industry, and this would weaken the United Canada that we currently have, which is largely subsidized through Alberta and its energy industry. And by saying no to and tariffing Canadian products, this inevitably, as Mr. Carney says, this this would break Canada, and this would give the United States an opportunity to actually access resources in the Canadian region. Now, why is this important? This is important because the main thing driving, I would say, a lot of political decisions these days is the development of AI. And you'll notice that the United States recently invested a large amount in their project Stargate, I think about $500 billion in conjunction with OpenAI and SoftBank to develop AI infrastructure and data centers across the United States. Data centers require a large amount of energy, and this is where Alberta comes in. There is a great deal of energy within Alberta, and I believe that accessing that may be the objective of the United States at a much cheaper rate than it is already sold at. But that's just my worldview based on what I've learned. There might be a lot of things that I'm missing in that analysis.
Well, Vivek, I know you're late to the party, but you have walked right into where we have landed when we talk about Fortress North America as opposed to Fortress America. That the sovereignty webinars or dinners that Bill spoke to and I facilitated were about an alternative to Fortress North America, which is the US pulling back, as opposed to a Fortress North America that reaches as far south as Panama and as far north as the Arctic. We think that's a better strategy. And in fact, it does appear that the concept of Fortress North America has surfaced. Thank God for Canada anyway. And hopefully Carney is well aware of that. And that the negotiations that words like subsidy trigger will lead to an appreciation that we are already economically integrated and probably need to get even further economically integrated around energy, and for the United States to recognize Canada as an energy superpower and its neighbor. Go ahead, Yogi. But thank you, Vivek. That was an excellent summary from someone who has joined the group who hasn't heard what it is we're advocating for. So you're welcome. Keep on coming back.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Yogi.
Thank you, Vivek. So I wanted to talk about where Trump is at for just a minute. I mean, his view of trade is totally ridiculous. I'm, I'm, I know he's been hoodwinked in some ways by some of his unusual advisors, but I think fundamentally he's also a fairly smart guy. So he has a very brash negotiating technique. So we're observing some of that. So I think he's totally wrong about what he says about trade with many nations, including Canada. And both nations, Canada and the US, benefit from the trade that is in existence at the moment. Where Trump is correct is when he claims that we're freeloading on American defense. Absolutely. In many ways, we're freeloading even more than the Europeans. Now, the Europeans have been awakened by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and are now, as Vivek said, making significant investments to up their manufacturing of defense equipment. It's interesting for me to note that Canada is continuing to be totally dysfunctional about defense procurement, and which is sad. And I'm not seeing there's much of a political interest in changing that, despite some nice words that we heard from Justin Trudeau.
Well, I mean, I'm hoping that we will hear from Carney, who's taken a position on tax relief with a tax cut for Canadians, that we'll hear shortly of a position on defense. I suspect they'll come around. I suspect that we I mean, maybe I'm being hopeful. Remember, I am a bit of a Pollyanna on many of these issues.
Well, so maybe there's also a wiggle room problem. He's about to make a small tax cut, and he's still facing a giant deficit and a huge debt.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much room he has to improve defense, even if he wants to.
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, that's the point. I don't think he can do everything that he has in mind. That $37 trillion debt looms large in terms of the interest payments. The liabilities associated with the commitment to the welfare system of health and education is severe. It isn't going to go away. So there's only so much you can cut. And foreign aid, of course, being what he's done with his foreign aid cuts on top of it. That's where Musk comes in. But my feeling is, and I'm gonna reach out a little bit here, that the Oilers are going to win. That's number one. But number two is Trump is going to wait to initiate negotiations with Canada to be last, because Canada is probably the easiest to negotiate with. Canada has something that I think he generally knows he needs, but he's going to wait it out. And he's going to hope that by the waiting it out, Canada gets very nervous and gives him a really good deal. And that's what I would do if I were cutting a deal. I would, if the other guy's got more cards than I've got, I'm going to wait him out. I'm going to let him keep on guessing what I really want. We already saw him give in Britain, and we've already saw him give in a little bit in China. I think he'll be giving in a lot to Canada, but I don't think he loses. I think the ultimate gain is win-win. The relationship that he has with Canada should be win-win on both sides, whether it be lumber, aluminum, steel, automobiles, automobile parts, minerals in the north, oil and gas, right up to the Mackenzie, and defense. On every one of those, Fortress North America can be strengthened.
And that's exactly right, Perry. Remember, whenever we say a nation doesn't need what Canada has, it's absolutely the truth. The United States doesn't need anything Canada has, but there's a difference between need and desire. Canada does subsidize the United States in oil, subsidize the United States in grain, subsidize the United States in lumber and other products. We do sell to the US at a discount. And the reason we do is because we have so much stuff of that, such quantities, it far exceeds our ability inside our own country to consume it. So if you grow food for yourself and then you have an abundance of tomatoes and you got all the tomatoes you need to eat, selling them for 10 cents instead of throwing them away or letting them rot makes you money. And that's Canada's position, is we way produce more food and energy, et cetera, than we possibly consume. So it's to our benefit to sell it to the US at a discount, because they're eager to get that discount, and it improves their lifestyle. Hence the whole concept of mutual trade. And yes, Fortress America is very important to the current US administration, and that's going to carry on for a long time. I agree. 2020 exposed the global threats to the economic models. And we're going to a multipolar world with Europe becoming integrated and dealing with whatever threat they think Russia has to them, which I don't think there's any threat, but that's another conversation. And China and Asia. I mean, consider the Pakistan-India flare-up. That's a geopolitical shockwave over the world, where Pakistan absolutely pushed back the immense Indian Air Force with no losses and took out 5 of their jets without them even being able to breach the border. That's demonstrated some geopolitical and military force that dominated by Chinese equipment, that's even shocked the United States on its capabilities. That's definitely put a chill down the spine of the U.S. military complex on the advanced technology and capability of the People's Liberation Army and Air Force. That's going to echo for a long time, and I know a lot of guys are really looking at that really hard. And that's just one small flare-up to demonstrate the immense capability of China, and it will more ingrain the Fortress North America gang in the United States to become more insular and avoid those type of conflicts with China, just as another point. Thank you.
Well, maybe as an alternative to next week, Bill, where I would like to address where we're going to get the leadership to save Canada, we should revisit the concept of Fortress North America. But that calls for an article. I'll have to ask ChatGPT for some help if you can't weigh in there. But clearly there is a reset going on to strengthen or recognize regional strengths, the region being Russia and Europe coming to an agreement, Asia finding its way to compromise. I don't know where South America fits in all this. I certainly know where North America. South America seems to be left out of the discussion, but and I'm never quite sure why. And by the way, I've got a commitment probably in September to visit South America with a buddy and go on a bit of a tour. But yeah, the world seems to be falling back into regional initiatives or regional interests. Go ahead, Dale.
The other thing, we've talked now about the economic and the military, but I think there's also the social. One of the things that's not being recognized with the initial threat of the 25% tariff was the challenge with respect to drug development with fentanyl. We look at the money laundering that's going on. I think Trump is working on a number of different areas all at once, and this sometimes can be, I think, very confusing, especially to people who aren't willing to look at all the elements at the same time. One of the other areas is the social side of things, or the social conservative, what I would call social conservative side. There are only 2 genders. The other thing that he has been very, very strong on is the climate issue, and the fact that the climate science has been pushed and had a polemic that is not necessarily provable and needs to be discussed further. And finally, the issue of related to our the racism and division that is being perpetrated, possibly to our disadvantage here in Canada. So I'm not sure that when we're looking at him the Americans subsidizing us, that it's just economic. There may be a broad range of areas where Trump is looking forward to changing the relationship, and part of that is Fortress America, because if you have Fortress America and you've got a bunch of rot in the north, as he would see it socially, he does not trust that. So that would be my comment on those areas.
Well, Tommy, you may still be muted. I can read your expression there, and I'll pick up on it on your behalf. It's not that climate change doesn't exist, because there seems to be, you either believe it or you don't believe it. If you don't believe it, therefore you do believe it, or vice versa. There's a middle ground. That middle ground, in my perspective, is respect for the environment. Now, the oil and gas industry views the environment as a critical value, and therefore is doing investing considerable amount of money in order to reduce the CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions associated with that industry. That being recognized by the federal government, because it says it wants to be a clean energy superpower. Clean doesn't mean carbon free. Clean means continuing to make an effort as a nation to make certain that the emissions out of the oil and gas industry are not excessive. And to the extent that Canada does that, and it leads the world in addressing emissions reduction in the energy industry, it leads the world with that technology, which is an illustration that Canada does care about the environment, that our oil and gas industry is not oblivious to the fact that it's important to respect the environment. You don't have to get into the climate change argument. It will lead into an academic, endless debate. So my easy way through that is to simply reflect on the environmental respect that Canada has and the United States has, and that's what we share. Yogi?
I really like your definition of clean energy. Sadly, there are quite a few people led by Stephen Gilbo and a few others who do not agree with your definition.
He's an advocate. He is not someone that's looking for compromise. His job and his manner and his namesake and his brand is pure. It's net zero. Zero meaning a zero.
Right. And probably, sadly, or there's no such thing as completely zero. It's almost impossible, short of destruction of big hunks of the economy. So I just wanted to reaffirm that I like what you said, and and I appreciate you mentioning that the oil industry has made significant investments and has made significant progress in reducing its environmental footprint, and continues to make those investments, and every indication that it will still that it'll continue to make progress. To get to zero will be nearly impossible.
Well, I think we're making headway in Canada. People recognizing that we are not a major global contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It's below 10%. I think
it's interesting that the three largest emitters of methane on the planet are Iran, Russia, and the United States.
Right.
So under Trump, sadly, that's not going to improve, when in fact there are just obvious, cheap ways for the American producers to significantly improve their performance.
So it's not that we're virtuous. We've spoken the language to the world that Canada does care. It recognizes that the climate is important. It wants to champion environmental respect, but it also wants to be a super energy power with clean energy or cleaner energy, and yet continue to help third world countries and other parts of the world that need energy, particularly in light of the rapid demand, the increasing demand of AI, with AI being a technology that is literally going to transform global economies. So you can't escape that. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You've got to find a compromise. And I think if Canada can find its way of portraying to the world at large that we are a super energy power, we have the cleanest source of oil and gas in the world, and we'll continue to make it as clean as possible, and work with the United States, I think it's win-win all the way around. But it's not going to happen overnight, in spite of what Guilbeault would like. And it's not going to get to zero. It's just not possible. So we're getting near to a bewitching hour. I turn into a pumpkin at that time, or a caretaker. I'm going to look to see Tommy.
Well, one thing, this concept of fortress North America, you're not looking, I think, is ignoring where we ought to be. We don't want to see the world built up in more fortresses. We don't want to see more and more money spent on munitions. Some of the things that Trump did with all this more munitions being sold to the Middle East, that's really the last thing the Middle East needs. Europe was on the right track. Germany was on the right track when they sought to really try to reach out to Russia and to bring them bring them into the modern world. They could not have anticipated, perhaps, that that Putin would turn out to be a totally evil person. Uh, and so the lack of expenditures on armament, and any expenditure on armament, is in the sense a total waste of human resources when there's so much else that needs to be done. What else to say? Oil, and yeah, oil may be the great thing now, but we're going to have to solve the energy problem. We're not going to solve it by clean oil. And when once we do solve it through nuclear, the value of oil will presumably plummet. And then all the billions of dollars that people want to put into pipelines will be, again, another total waste.
You know, with all respect, I think there's no question, whether it be fission or ultimately fusion, that nuclear will play a very significant role. The question is, how soon is the future? And whether or not pipelines will be needed in the interim, and whether that's a 20 or 50 year, I don't think any of us know, but the investors need some degree of confidence that putting $1 in is not going to result in somebody closing it down a day later. So investors are not stupid with regard to their financing, but they are asking, we need more capacity in this interim period, which I suspect takes you to 2050.
Instead of spending all that money on pipelines, we'd be spending it on upgrading our nuclear capabilities and clean capabilities all the much sooner. It may be too late for them to get all the money they want to get out of their pipelines before the world becomes uninhabitable.
I don't argue with you about the spending on nuclear, particularly in the area of fusion, which we've talked about at great length.
Yeah.
And Canada is the only G7 nation in the world that has no position as it relates to fusion, at least at the public sector level. We do have General Fusion out of Vancouver, which is private sector investment. But the federal government seems to have ignored fusion altogether, no matter how many times it's been approached. But Fusion Energy Canada, which was founded through the Alberta Council of Technologies and the University of Alberta about 10 years ago. So hopefully we'll be there. I now have a little after 5:30. I'm delighted we got everybody unmuted. I think everybody's had a say. Do I see any hands missing? Thank you, Vivek, very much for joining us today, and you're welcome to bring you and youth to the table. Tom, Shirley, Mel, Elona, Dale, Bogdan, Bill, Ann, Yogi, Milson, Tommy for sure, Randall. Thank you all.